Hey guys, I'm joined by my friend Jeremy, and we're doing a movie review. The movie we want to review is the 1932 horror classic, The Mummy. Now, The Mummy was produced and distributed by Universal Pictures, and this was basically sort of their follow-up to their adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula and their adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, both of which came out the year prior. Now, unlike those movies, which were both based on books, The Mummy was a completely original story, directed by Karl Freund, who is actually the cinematographer for Dracula, and written by John L. Balderston, who actually wrote the screenplay for Frankenstein and Dracula. However, the original story for the film was written by Richard Schayer and Nina Wilcox Putnam. The film was partly inspired by the 1922 opening of King Tut's tomb. So, the plot of The Mummy is it begins in 1921, where these archaeologists discover the mummy of an ancient Egyptian named Imhotep, who we soon learn was actually mummified alive for defying the gods by trying to resurrect his lover, an ancient Egyptian princess. One of these archaeologists reads from a scroll and inadvertently brings Imhotep back to life and then goes insane. The movie jumps ahead to 10 years later. Imhotep is now walking among the living, and he ends up meeting a woman named Helen, who he believes to be the reincarnation of his lost lover, and he's determined to be reunited with her, but in the process will end up turning her into a living mummy like he is. So Helen's boyfriend and a doctor who believes in the supernatural now have to stop Imhotep. Now, in the film, Boris Karloff, who previously played the Frankenstein monster in James Whale's Frankenstein, plays Imhotep, or Arden Bey, which is an alias that he uses throughout the film. Now, that image of Karloff in the mummy bandages in his casket is one of the most iconic images in horror history, but it might actually surprise people that you only actually see him in the mummy bandages in the beginning. Throughout most of the movie, he's walking around like a regular human. You also have Zita Johann as Helen, and I gotta say, she had this real kind of exotic quality to her that made her fit the character of Helen really well. You also have David Matters, who previously played Jonathan Harker in Todd Browning's Dracula as Frank Wemple, Helen's love interest. And you have Edward Van Sloan, who previously played Van Helsing in Dracula and also played a supporting role in Frankenstein, playing Dr. Muller in this movie, who I gotta say is a very, very, very similar character to his version of Van Helsing, and something I do want to bring up is this movie does have a lot of the same story beats as Dracula. You also have African-American actor Noble Johnson as a Nubian servant. Unfortunately, he's playing a very stereotypical role for African-American actors at the time, but this actor would actually go on to play the chief of Skull Island in the original King Kong, which came out a year later. What did you think of The Mummy?
It's pretty good. You know, it's got a lot of creepy scenes, and of course the legendary Boris Karloff in the lead role. So yeah, I liked it.
I like it a lot. I don't think it's as good as Frankenstein or Dracula by any means, but no, it is a solid horror film. It really is. And the Mummy himself, Imhotep, you do actually feel bad for him. Like, he is a sympathetic villain, I think, when you consider his backstory, and really all he wants to do is be with the woman he loves, you know? Yeah. So, you do feel for this character.
Yes, I agree.
So what do you think of, like, besides Boris Karloff, what do you think of, like, Edward Van Sloan?
He's good. Universal had a habit of casting him in the roles of they usually cast him as the one who, I guess, knows how to defeat the monster. You got David Manners as another one of the heroes of the movie. He was also in Dracula, and he's good in both.
Yeah.
And he lived to the ripe old age of 98 years old.
What do you think of the main female protagonist in the film?
It's pretty good. She actually had a very hostile relationship with the director of this movie.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, she did. They did not get along. They use this close-up shot of Boris Karloff's face several times, and it's really creepy.
Yeah.
I think it was a good move on their part. That makeup took 8 hours to do from Jack Pierce. But yeah, it was only used for that first scene. The rest of the time you see him, he's not wrapped up. The makeup does look amazing, though, when you do see it.
Yes, I agree. Well, I mean, he's in makeup even, like, throughout the movie, because they definitely make him look, like, wrinkled and older than Karloff actually was at the time.
Yeah, I agree, although that makeup's not as extensive as the mummy makeup.
Yeah.
Wrapped up.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to bring up how, I guess it's a little problematic that technically the character's Egyptian, and I'm pretty sure Karloff wasn't Egyptian, but this was fucking 1932. I mean, what?
Yeah, they didn't care back then.
But no, The Mummy is a really solid horror film. It's not one of my favorites, but it is a good, very atmospheric little horror film.
Yes, I agree. I actually only watched it for the first time yesterday.
Yeah, I've seen it a few times. I saw it once when I was a little kid, and didn't see the movie again until, like, a year or so ago. And again, it's nowhere near as good as Frankenstein or Dracula, or even, like, later films like Bride of Frankenstein or The Wolfman. Like, I would much rather watch those movies over this one, but I think it deserves its place in sort of the canon of the Universal monsters.
Yeah, I agree.
It also should be noted that this was a pre-code movie. They got away with some things that they wouldn't have been able to get away with once the Hays Code was put into effect a few years later. But honestly, even pre-code, this movie has some things that I could see being considered kind of risque for 1932. Like, there's some outright sexual dialogue between David Matters and Zita Johann earlier on in the film. Also, later on, Imhotep dresses her up in this Egyptian garb that, honestly, for the time, is quite revealing. Also, in the flashback, when you find out Imhotep's backstory, you find out that they actually killed the slaves who helped bury him to keep the existence of his tomb a secret, and you actually see a slave impaled. And honestly, yeah, for 1932, I could see that scene being considered kind of shocking. That's something that you would never see a few years later once the Hays Code was put into effect. Now, this spawned a series of sort of unofficial sequels. Like, the other Mummy movies that Universal did were not initially meant to be sequels to this. In retrospect, those are now considered to be part of this. Like, they're kind of... This is considered to be the first of Universal's Mummy series. Now, have you seen any of the quote-unquote sequels?
I think I've seen a couple of them. I don't recall which ones, but yeah, with the Mummy Karis.
Yeah, and then Hammer actually did a remake of this in the 50s. Hammer's version of The Mummy also kicked off its own series, which included The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, The Mummy's Shroud, and Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. But from what I understand, none of those movies are actually direct sequels to Hammer's version of The Mummy. They're just other films that happen to be about live-in mummies that Hammer put out. And then, of course, in the late 90s, they did another remake of this with Brendan Fraser, which was more of an action-adventure film than a straight horror film. What do you think of the 90s version of The Mummy?
I've actually only seen the sequel to that, The Mummy Returns.
Oh, really?
I actually watched the first one.
Oh, it's good. It's good. I enjoyed the Brendan Fraser Mummy movies quite a bit, at least the first two. Third one kind of sucked, and I know there was an animated series based on it. The Brendan Fraser Mummy movies also had a spin-off called The Scorpion King, which itself spawned several sequels. And then in 2017, you had another remake of The Mummy with Tom Cruise, which was an attempt to start a cinematic universe. Like, Dr. Jekyll is a prominent character in that movie, played by Russell Crowe. The original The Mummy, if you're a fan of the Universal monster films, you should check it out.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
So my next movie review will be on 1940's The Mummy's Hand.